Next on our Ignite Learning stage is a young man very near and dear to my heart. He came to Duluth to be a student at UMD, but stayed in Duluth because of our extraordinary community and our beautiful outdoors area. He's taught at an international baccalaureate school in Slovenia and currently is the technology teacher here at Lincoln Park Middle School. A tinkerer and learner by nature, please welcome Paul Manoppo with his story, Gamifying Your Life.
Good evening. So my name is Paul Manoppo. Yes, I'm a teacher here at Lincoln Park. And being an educator, I'm exposed to those little those light bulb moments every single day. And I love them. I love seeing them. I love that everything goes with them. And even with all the challenges that arise in the world of education, I wouldn't trade it for anything. That being said, I've gone back and forth over what I'm going to say tonight. And after thinking about it, I realized I wanted to talk mainly about self-ignition. And what I mean by that is motivating yourself when there aren't friends, family, a boss, a teacher, when there isn't someone like that that's there to sort of kick you in the gear. So I hope that sharing my own experiences tonight reminds you of the last time you were truly motivated intrinsically to do something or learn something for yourself and start the gears turning on your next learning adventure. And I love hearing all of the stories tonight about family, about relatives, about parents and grandparents. And I think that's sort of a great place to start because we all have that sort of unique family. And mine was no exception. My mom had a multitude of health issues while I was growing up, so my dad was the primary person who raised me. And I guess a few things about my dad, his English is not so good. And so usually you have to meet him 3 or 4 times before you can even begin to understand what he's saying. But even if you don't fully understand what's going on, what he's saying, you still get this idea that there's something going on up top. There's a lot going on. And even though he might not be able to articulate himself as best as he could, you just get this idea. This guy has a bunch of wisdom. On top of this, he's been an inventor his entire life. I can't think of a year that he wasn't tinkering or trying to do something new, make something new, and not for any monetary reason, but just because he could. So I remember the time that his eyes lit up when I asked him to help me, hey, would you just kind of help me build a gaming computer? And as a 12-year-old boy, it was just a request so that I could play the same games that my friends were playing. It was just a request so that I could have that fun that every other kid was looking for. But to him, it was a chance to instill some lifelong lessons within me. So he said, sure, go online. Fill up the shopping cart, tell me what you need. And this was like I was struck. I was shocked that he had said that. And so I spent the rest of the night just sort of filling the cart, figuring out what I needed to make this computer. Smile on my face. I came back the next day. And this is where reality set in. Because as I presented my list to my dad, he immediately settled on the motherboard that I chose. And for those of you that don't know what a motherboard in a computer is, that's okay, because apparently me as a 12-year-old had no issue spending $100 of my parents' money, and I had no idea what it was. So he looked at me and he said, so why that motherboard? Well, I don't know. It seemed like the one everyone else was buying. It had good reviews. Okay, but why that motherboard? So as I sort of fumbled around answering this question, trying to remember what I had read the night before while I was flipping through what to buy, my dad went through each of these parts and he scanned them, and he asked me similar questions about them too. So I said, okay, pump the brakes. I see what's going on here. Let me do a little bit of research. Let me go back, see what I can figure out, and then I'll be back. So I realized there was no way that my dad would ever let me order these parts if I couldn't answer his questions. So I went back to the computer. And if my dad was giving me a hard time, I'd just research those things. I'd figure it out, because after all, it was his money. He had a right to ask. So the next day, I returned again with my list. Okay, so a motherboard is like the circuit board that connects all of the different parts of the computer together. Without it, the RAM, the processor, none of it would be able to communicate. I picked this one mainly because it'll work with my processor that I picked. And before I could even say what processor I picked, before I could explain what the other parts on my list did, he'd already had another question. That's right, but how does it work? Didn't I just tell you that? Didn't I just explain that it's like the computer version of a skeleton connecting every one of my parts together? Yeah, that's right. But how does it work? So remember a little bit ago I said reality set in as a 12-year-old boy. But as he was asking me this question, my 12-year-old brain had redefined reality setting in to a much greater, more soul-crushing level. Not only was my dad asking me to understand what each part of a computer did, he was asking me to go out, get a degree in computer engineering, and come back and tell me how it did it. I distinctly remember sulking and moping around the house, thinking I was never going to get this computer. But then, as the stubborn child I was, I started to research so that I could show my dad I could do this. I read and I read and I read, and I learned about circuitry, electrical switches, and so many other things. I only scratched the surface, and there was a lot of things that went over my head and was way too complex for me. But I came to understand the value of pursuing knowledge. At that moment, my outlook on learning leveled up. Somewhere in there, I quit researching how computers work so that I get that gaming computer, and I kept researching because I was hooked. I wanted to know more. I craved reaching those aha moments and knowing that I understood something solely because of my own intrinsic motivation. Even after the computer was built, a curiosity was sparked inside of me. So fast forward to my days in college, I had moved to Duluth, and Google had become my best friend. It was there to answer all of my questions, and having the motivation to answer all of your day-to-day curiosities is great, but it doesn't quite pay the bills. So being broke, having a computer in front of me, one thing led to another, and I stumbled upon these YouTube videos, and there was this guy, and he was nice enough to share his knowledge on how to fix cell phones, how to take them apart, and how to repair them. And I thought this was great. This was just around the time that cell phone repair was becoming a thing. I could use this, and this was my ticket out of being a broke college kid for the next 4 years. So after many hours of watching these videos, it was time to give it a shot. So I remember buying an iPhone 4S. And I remember it was like right when the iPhone 4S came out, it was like the hottest phone to get. And I met up with this guy on Craigslist, and he's like, I had dropped this phone once. Just once. It cracked the screen. Didn't turn on anymore. And I remember just meticulously taking this phone apart, and I remember following the videos, and it honestly kind of reminded me of building a gaming computer with my dad all those years ago. And after removing tiny screw after tiny screw and pulling out all the different components to get to the screen, I was finally able to replace it and put it back together. And that's where I thought the story would end. New screen, I took my time, I watched the videos, I was really patient. But it didn't. It didn't even power on. Not even a sound. And while this was not my first run-in with failure, it was at a time when I didn't have very much money, and I was taking a pretty big risk. It was like this or ramen noodles, so I was pretty close. So as a little bit of a spoiler, this is from this past school year where I got to do through a win or what I need, I got to do a workshop where 6th through 8th graders actually brought in their phones and were able to fix them. So if you were worried that things didn't work out, that I was a little homeless after this, it was not, and I was able to get those skills. But I sulked around the house again. I thought, man, what am I going to do? And it took me a few days to figure out that, you know what, I'm going to take apart this phone. I'll put it back together. If it doesn't turn on, it'll at least be another hands-on experience to go with watching these videos. And if I'm being completely honest with you, that phone never turned on. I never, ever got it. Maybe it lived a much worse life than being dropped just once. Maybe I was too experienced, but it just never came around. But I did remove every single piece of that phone and put it back together more times than I could count. And during that time, I learned about parts that are more common to fail and why. I learned about how to scour the internet to diagnose a problem, and even what to look for before I bought another phone. I ended up using these skills to fix some phones of friends that I had in college. And I used the money, in turn, to buy phones and fix them and resell them. The money I earned doing the repairs didn't always come. And there were points where it was rocky, and I can't tell you how much money I lost at certain points or broke something along the way. But every failure became one of those things that I began to realize and look at as sort of necessary to the process. Not a setback, but something that needed to happen for me to learn and understand what I was doing to a greater extent. I'd leveled up again. It didn't stop there either. As I started to repair phones, fix them, and resell them, I basically learned how to run a small business. I learned how to keep detailed inventory, how to track trends, how to monitor profit and losses. I learned the intricacies of not just selling locally, but selling on eBay and other sites to customers around the world. I learned to diversify. There were months where I didn't sell a single or buy a single phone. Instead, I watched websites related to flipping anything and everything. I learned about when clearance items drop to their lowest price, where to pick up antiques and collectibles, and where to hunt for, and how to source bulk items from distributors. By the end of my time at UMD, I paid for a good chunk of my living expenses and school expenses with this job. And eventually I even used it to pay for my trip to Slovenia, where I taught at an IB school before graduating. While it's not as much of a full-time now as it once was, I still love doing this when I can. So there are so many other stories that I could share with you about learning experiences like this, whether it be the first time I decided, yeah, I'll buy a manual transmission car. I've never driven one. We'll just go out and buy one in Duluth. To this past year, where I thought it was a great idea to do a very tech-heavy lesson when the internet went down, and then I kept going even when that happened. But if I could share any piece of advice with you, it would be to gamify your life. It wasn't until recently, when I was thinking about how lucky I've been with the skills that I've obtained so far in life, that I realized that a lot of how I live my life is how I play video games. So I'm a little bit nerdy, and I've definitely played quite a few video games in my time, but they weren't just an outlet for my free time. They were a way to stretch my brain and view my problems in other aspects of my life in a different light. So there's a guy by the name of Tom Chatfield. He does an excellent TED Talk on how video games can engage your brain, and I'm sure he can definitely do a more eloquent explanation of the reasons behind this than I can. So I'd just like to leave you with a few tips for viewing your life in a more game sense. And this might seem like no-brainers, but I think we forget a lot of this when we're caught up in the moment. And even though I talk about these ideas related to video games, I think they're applicable to anything that you might love in life, whether it be a sport, just getting outdoors, but finding ways to bring that back to the harder parts and the problems in your life. So number one, acknowledge and reward incremental progress. Acknowledge when you've leveled up, because those small successes are what give you momentum. If a video game didn't reward you for playing it, no one would play it. And the same goes for the tough times in your life and when you overcome them. Figure out how to attach rewards to every part of your life, especially when you meet your goals. Number two, use past experiences to solve new problems. The great thing about a good video game is that they're hard. A good video game, you're definitely overcoming like a problem, a boss, or some other challenge. And you feel really good when this happens, and you feel even better when you're able to take the challenges that you've overcome and those experiences and apply them to a new challenge. It's not quite a feeling of safety, but you just feel a little bit more comfortable going into the unknown. And number three, celebrate failure. Everyone flops. Like I said, I don't know how many times I lost money or I broke something, but I never looked at it as just strictly a failure. you're not failing, you're not learning. Take the time to recover from a failure, but also take the time to learn from it. I think failure is one of the biggest obstacles that we come across in our lives, and it's one that we're often afraid of. That means it can occupy our mind during the day and keep us up at night. And if we can eliminate the feelings and view it in a different light, we can start on the path of least resistance. So I hope with these three things, these sort of guidelines, and hearing me speak tonight, it's made you think of times you genuinely enjoyed learning in the same way that I have, even if it was just playing a video game. And I hope you find new ways to apply the philosophy behind a good game, a sport, or whatever that thing that you love to do is to the rest of your life. Thank you, and have a good night.